Hey, welcome to the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Dave Kimura.
Hey everyone.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And this week we're talking to Andy Hunt. Andy, do you want to say hello and remind people why we love you?
Hello. Well, I'm not sure about that part, but you may have heard of me. So I was one of the co-authors of the Pragmatic Programmer with Dave Thomas, which was, I since found out, is now the most recommended book on software ever. They did an analysis
really?
about a year or two ago, and it was the most recommended book on software development, which was pretty cool. And that just came out. We came out the 20th anniversary edition of that. So that book's been going strong for over 20 years and is still, as spot on as it was back in the day. I was one of the folks who wrote the Agile Manifesto back around the turn of the century, back in 2001. And I've been running the Pragmatic Bookshelf for most of this time, and producing books that people really seem to like. Really helped them in their careers, helped them get on top of the latest trends, latest technologies, all that sort of thing. I also write science fiction and thriller books, sort of as a side project, which is a lot of fun.
That sounds like fun. Let's just pick your brain on that.
Sure. Which part?
I'm just kidding. Yeah, I dabble in writing fiction. I haven't done any serious writing that way for a long time, though. So it's probably something I would want to get back into at some point. But yeah, when we were talking before the show, you mentioned that you've kind of had some ideas bouncing around your head as far as what developers should know, like what things we should be doing, stuff like that. I'm a little curious, what kinds of things are you thinking about now? And I'm also a little curious as to whether or not this is different from what you would have recommended 10, 20 years ago.
Oh, well, I'll address that first. I definitely think it's different to what I would have suggested any number of years ago. And I'll probably recommend something different, but maybe not 10 years from now, because the world keeps changing, right? I mean, what software development is today is really nothing like what it was back when I started. I've been writing code commercially, I started 40 years ago. So I was on email before there was an @ sign, right? Everything was a bang path to IHNP4 in the days of Usenet. So I've seen some stuff, over the years. And definitely, back then you could start off a project with VI main.c. And that was kind of all you had. You had some operating system calls, and you had some very simple libraries to concatenate strings and take the square root. And that was about it. Anything else you wanted, you had to write, which is a far cry from today where, proportionally, how much actual original code do you ever write compared to the number of libraries, frameworks, everything that you've got supporting you? It's really a very different ball game in that regard, which is kind of funny because, you'll see these great debates spring up about, well, should we do a monolith or microservices, or should we do this or we do that or whatever? And those are all kind of irrelevant, or at least very context dependent. It's like, well, it depends. And so what? Those aren't really the interesting questions. The interesting questions, or the interesting problems, I think, my top four things that I think are most important to development here in late 2022. Number one, right off the bat, you need an absolutely impeccable, reliable, automated build, test, deploy, CI/CD kind of system. No excuses. That has to be there. It has to be rock solid. And some folks will do that, but then not really use it well. They'll do long running feature branches or some kind of garbage like that. And it's like, no. The whole point of doing that is to get fast feedback, to do trunk based development. So number one, pipeline trunk based development for fast feedback, and get out of this, ticket closing factory mentality. But I'll talk more about that later. Number 2, you need effective, low friction collaboration. And, one of the popular ways of talking about that these days is psychological safety in the workplace, which I think folks misunderstand a lot. It's not about sitting around holding hands and, singing Kumbaya or anything. It's about having free information flow in an organization. And that's absolutely critical because that's the raw material we work with. And if you don't have free information flow because some department's hoarding information, or folks are acting territorially or not sharing or whatever, then you're kind of screwed. And it doesn't matter at that point if you're doing microservices or monolith or you're using this framework or that. None of that matters because you're just hosed right out of the gate. So those are the top 2. And that goes nicely, I think, to number 3. You need constant learning and skills improvement. Read voraciously. Read a book, and when you finish it, read another book. And they should be tech books. As a publisher of tech books, I can somewhat selfishly say that, but they should also be not technical books. Read things on anthropology, on psychology, read fiction. I made a real mistake, I think, growing up. For many years, I would not really read any fiction books because I was under the impression that, well, it's fiction. Somebody just made this up. It's not true. Not realizing that fiction books it's a different thing. Yes, the story is fiction, but it contains a lot of truth. And that's a very important distinction that I think we miss out on. And especially when you start talking about the role of ethics in software development, which is a growing and very important topic, you need to have a little bit more exposure to that, which I think you get from reading books by people with different points of view, different realms, reading science fiction or historical fiction, or, maybe something you don't normally read, but being able to see what the rest of the world is thinking and up to, that's a very important way of doing it. Much better than, say, following somebody on Facebook or Twitter, perhaps. So we need that free information flow. We need that collaboration. We need the constant learning and skills improvement, because really the 2 things that programmers have to do all the time is communicate and learn. That's really what the job comes down to. We're communicating with our team members, with the sponsors, the end users, whoever that might be, with the system itself. And we have to learn from all these things. We learn how to work with our teammates. We're learning from the developing system under construction. We're learning the arena that we're programming in, the domain area. We're learning the new technology, right? It's a very old joke, but today's Thursday. There's been 3 new JavaScript frameworks just came out this morning, right? I mean, it's an absolutely endless fire hose of, okay, we have to do this now. And here's this new thing and whatever it might be, right? So we're learning all the time. We can't just sit back and say, okay, I know a programming language now, I'm done. It doesn't work that way. So skills improvement, learning, third pillar of what's most important. And the last thing for now, number 4, we have to rethink what we're building and how we're building it. We want to be able to design replaceable, disposable software. If it doesn't go to plan, or if the world changes out from underneath us, we want to be able to rip it out and replace it with something else. That's a much better way of thinking about software than trying to waste time making it maintainable or extensible or any of those sorts of popular words. Because the problem is, when you want to make software maintainable or extensible, you're fortune telling. You're trying to imagine a future where the software will be used this way, or this might change, or that might change. And if anything, COVID, Russia's invasion, the RSV, flu, all the stuff that's happening in the world, we suck at fortune telling as a species, right? Massive things will come up, and we're unprepared for it. We have no idea that these things could change, and wow, look, they do. So we want software to be replaceable and disposable and not quite so big chunks of critical. Um, G. Paul Hill has a great saying. He says, we really need to look at taking many more, much smaller steps. And I think that's absolutely critical because, you know, it kills me when someone's doing like some kind of, nonsense BS story point planning meeting and something is, 12 points or something huge. It's like, no, 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 that's way too big a bite. That's too big a chomp. You're never even going to finish that. If you really must estimate in story sizes, there's really only three answers. Something either has a story size of 1, meaning you could do this in maybe a couple hours and have something, passing tests and to show for it. That's answer 1. Or answer 2, it's too big. It's more than 1. So you've got to slice it into thinner pieces so you can get it down to a number of things of size 1. Or number 3, I don't know. I don't know how big this really is. So it's going to take some learning, some prototyping, some discussions to get down to the point where it's a size of 1. So really, the only appropriate size to work on is 1. Otherwise, it's too big a bite, and you haven't thought through that yet. So those are the 4, I think, most important things. And if you notice, they're all kind of around the same sort of theme. You've got this continuous paradigm, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous learning, continuous discussions with the users, the sponsors, continuous, discovery, if you will. I hate to call it requirements, right? We used to call it requirements analysis, which I think was the worst possible, right? Charles is chuckling there. That's like the worst possible term because it just, right? It's static. It screams staticness. It's like the requirements are sitting here in this steaming pile outside my office, and I'm going to go through and analyze them and, come up with stuff. And it has never worked that way, right? The world does not function that way. It is a journey of shared discovery. You're learning what the system can do. The users, whoever's involved, the sponsors are learning what it can do as it comes up and starts to do its thing. And, you get some unexpected surprises. There's that sort of Heisenberg nature of software that once it's doing its thing, you realize, oh, well, what I really wanted, was it to do this or let's change this? Or even though I say, in this day and age, you started off with exactly what it should have been, but now it's 6, 12, 18 months later, the world has changed. And that's not what you need to do anymore. You need to pivot. You need to do something a little bit different. So one way I like to try to explain people to function in this sort of an environment is to think about building software in, these many more, much smaller steps, very thin slices, end to end. So you start off day 1 of the project and you write hello world, but it goes from one end of the project to the other, all the way from the web client or whatever front end through to the database, whatever crap you got in the middle, your ML engine, your whatever. But it's only hello world, but it touches all the bits and pieces. And there's a great when I give talks, I got a great set of images that goes with this. And I didn't know this, but when they built the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, do you know how they actually built that? It's really fascinating. They started basically with like a single cable. You run one cable from one end to the other, and you use that to bring the next cable over, and you use those two to bring the next. And there's a picture, old black and white of maybe, I don't know, a dozen cables strung across the bay there with workers hanging off of them, adding stuff on. Adding, clamps and bits and more cables and this and stuff. And, you get up to the point where it'll hold enough weight. You can start bringing decking over, and so on and so forth. And that's how we should build software, thin end-to-end slices, because that gets you into those very small steps. So you have a nice small success. All the unit tests turn green. Everything's good. You're proceeding from a stable position all the time. So technically, what you have is always deployable. You don't have this, code freeze for 2 months before you release it, or this. Well, we can't demo it to the potential investors because the code doesn't compile right now. These are not statements you want to hear yourself making, like, ever, right? And of course we do. I mean, 'cause of course we fall into these these sorts of issues, but we don't have to. And I would actually argue, and we've been saying this kind of stuff for decades now, right? This style used to be called, walking skeleton. We called it tracer bullet development in Pragmatic Programmer. The idea is out there, and I think relatively few people actually do it. And maybe we could have gotten away with that back in an earlier day, but in this day and age, it's actually even more critical to get that first end-to-end step running, because you've got so much, configuration and third-party bits that have to line up for the thing to work. There was a great infographic probably a couple of years ago now that showed AWS's recommended deployment for a simple WordPress blog. And of course, it used all the AWS bits and pieces, right? So you had fall over and fail over and DNS replicate, all this stuff happening. And the bloody thing looked like the subway map to Manhattan. It was just ridiculously complex and complicated for a blog. This wasn't even,
Right.
A big app, right? This was sort of the minimum price of entry. And that was before Kubernetes became, a thing. Right. So now you've got your Dockers, your containers, your Kubernetes orchestration, all this crap going just to get hello world up and running. Ain't as simple as it once was.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of ideas here that I'm enjoying, but in this case, you can just spin up a VPS and install WordPress on it, right? Like, that's still an option. Or you can go find a service that's specialized to WordPress and stand it up, right? But we have this idea that we have to do things the other way. And, in our software, now we're, taking the metaphor the other direction. And so it's, I've got to deploy it to Kubernetes, and I've got to jump through all these hoops, and I have to use a cloud storage for my images, and this and this and this and this and this, instead of, just, hey, maybe it stores the images locally on the machine for right now when you do an upgrade, and then you roll the next piece, and then you roll the next piece. And then I like the direction that goes, because then it's not this upfront overwhelming thing that I have to figure out.
My issue with that kind of thing is vendor lock-in. So your AWS WordPress example, I would avoid that at all costs, because using their CloudFormation and all the other utilities that they have to deploy something, I'm not going to be able to easily lift and shift that to another provider if I choose, which I've had to, in my career, had to do that on a single application a few times, because the company direction changes, as you were saying, Eddie. As the world changed, so must we, if we want to stay current. And so the organization had different partners and decided to shift infrastructures. And the times that we had used something like a CloudFormation, it was a real pain to replicate that on Google Cloud or Azure.
Mm-hmm.
So I think using Kubernetes isn't a big deal. I'm not a huge fan of Kubernetes. I like the idea. I'm more of a Docker Swarm person, but I would still prefer Kubernetes over something like CloudFormation, because that's because of Google opening it up. It's kind of been a standard. You have basically any host offering some sort of Kubernetes that's compatible with your infrastructure scripts, with your YAML files. So I think from that perspective, it's okay. But anything that's going to cause a vendor lock-in, I have an issue with. And I think that kind of speaks to your third point about, writing maintainable code, or, clever code or whatever, where if I am going to be writing something that integrates with the third party like Twilio, just a simple SMS service. I don't want to be locked into that vendor where if we have to switch to another one because company direction changes, then I don't want to have to rewrite half my application. I want to only touch that one small Twilio integration piece. So having abstraction layers on top of Twilio, so my application consumes Twilio through this extracted layer or this interface
Absolutely.
for it.
Absolutely. You have to have insulation, really with anything third party. I mean, that's sort of a given, as much as you can in this day and age, because absolutely things change. Companies get bought by Microsoft, and now you can't use them, or now you have to use them, or whatever it might be. That's sort of always been the case. But I think the bigger issue here is folks tend, it seems to me, to gravitate towards very overly complicated, higher end solutions when they're not needed. I mean, I'm constantly telling people, you are not Netflix. You are not Spotify. You don't have billions of streams of users to engineer with and contend with. You have, a much smaller user base. So like Charles was saying earlier, store the image locally for now. That's probably fine for whatever stage of growth, that you're at. And I find it really interesting. I don't know if you all have seen Wardley mapping. Um, but it's a really interesting look at how to place the sort of business activities on a spectrum from custom made and Genesis through to something that you would just buy, to something that's just commodity and you don't even think about it. So electrical power is a commodity for the most part, unless you're Google and you need to be next to Niagara Falls to jack into the power. For most of us, electricity is just a commodity. We don't think about it. A lot of these sorts of services that we used to have to write by hand, it's just a commodity now. You don't even think about it. You don't even particularly worry about vendor lock-in, because it's just such a common, ubiquitous small thing. But of course, this is a spectrum, all the way from we have to build it completely ourselves to we buy it, but we have to customize it through it's just part of the woodwork, and we don't even care. The interesting thing with Wardley Maps is that wherever these things are now on the spectrum, they're always gradually drifting to the right, gradually drifting towards the side of becoming commodity. And it's something you don't even worry about. So today's fanciest, chat GPT, stable diffusion sort of AI stuff, which is, very much in its experimental, interesting viral stage, that will end up being a feature on a chip that's just there and you just use and you don't even think about it in time. And maybe that's a short time, maybe that's a long time, but eventually that's what happens to everything. It drifts over and becomes a commodity, which is interesting. So as you're trying to figure out, where to add value in your products, in your organization, what you want to, how you want to make your mark on the world, you really need to take a more careful look at, is this something we should be writing at all in the first place? Or should we just be using, a library, part of a framework to do this? Or is there a real advantage to not doing what everyone else is doing and adding something unique and a different take on it? I found this, absolutely was the case with the Pragmatic Bookshelf business. When we started off, we basically had to build our own storefront, our own shopping cart, all of our own integrations to other vendors, all these sorts of things, because our own EPUB generation, our own PDF generation, because none of this stuff existed out there in the world. It wasn't even available. We had to do it all custom. Fast forward 20 years, we're doing almost none of that custom anymore. That's all through a third party, through a provided library, through a service, whatever it might be, because all these things went from being, custom needed to, oh yeah, hell, everyone's got that. Everyone and their dog has a shopping cart. Everyone has a EPUB generator, whatever it might be. Which gets back to my point of, because of this constant drive in our capitalist economy towards commodification of these sorts of things, you really need that replaceability aspect to it. as Dave was saying here a second ago about avoiding vendor lock-in, sure, but you have to start off on the sort of premise that any vendor you use, even if it's real foundational like AWS versus Azure or whatever, you have to assume that that could go away in a heartbeat for any reason. You know, Twitter is a good example. You know, suppose you had, very tight integration to Twitter, and this was a big part of your business plan, a big part of your app, and now all of a sudden somebody buys it and the rules have changed. And you may not be using that in another 2 weeks, 6 months, whatever. I mean, those
Mhm.
literally, these are the scope of changes that we sort of face in the real world, which is daunting to say the least.
And I wanted to say something about your fourth point about keeping the stories very small and short. I think I'm right there with you, where often enough I'm given a huge story, and
Mhm.
I kind of see it like the butterfly effect, where the smaller the story is, the closer you are to that, squashing that butterfly, the more accurate you can predict the short term effect that it'll have. As a story grows, you're at a much further perspective away from that butterfly, and the accuracy is going to be all over the place. It's impossible to predict what's going to actually happen, how long it's actually going to take.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And the interesting thing to me is if you have any experience in industry, these things. You've seen these things happen. You realize that that's sort of the case. You might not be able to do anything about that because the process
Hmm.
that your organization is using doesn't allow you the flexibility to put it into smaller slices or talk to the user or whatever. I was given a workshop the other day, and one of the issues comes up. It's like, well, in this case, you should talk to your users to work through this issue. And this one guy sort of blew up. He's like, I've never met our users. I have no idea who they are or how they're using the software. It's like, well, I think we've just diagnosed your problem, right there. Um, but it's an interesting point because, right. Okay. So we're saying, like, right here that yes, being able to slice up the understanding of a requirement into very small approachable steps, that's a skill. That's something you need to learn how to
Mhm.
do. It's do they teach that in university or college? Hell no. Right? Is this something you get on the job training explicitly? No. There's a couple workshops on it. There might be a book or two here or there, but it's kind of a very, it's just not talked about. And that's kind of the biggest problem with all these issues. These are things that, we've identified, other folks have identified as being very important, and it's not anywhere in our educational pipeline, either in formal education or code camps or, on the job onboarding kinds of things. It's not there. Um, so one thing that I've been working on to try to help that, one of the workshops that I give through the Grows Method Institute is we have this kind of project simulation, and it's different from the other sorts of project simulators I've seen out there. I've seen a lot of things that'll put you through the paces of basically how to be a ticket closer, how to how to work with GitHub or GitLab, and how to get a ticket in Jira and how to close it and go through the steps and move it from here to there on your Kanban board. It's very mechanical and to me not very interesting. So we have a very different approach. We have this project simulator where you accept activities to work on, but you have to make decisions. You have to decide, am I going to invest a lot in this feature, or am I going to do it cheap and cheerful? And the answer is not always clear which one's better. Sometimes it's better to go one way, sometimes it's better to go the other way. Um, Decisions come up where, okay, the team has stumbled onto this problem. We've got this issue with this team member, or this edict came down from on high, or this team is threatening to quit because of this, or whatever. The sort of situations that come up in real life. And you have to make decisions of, well, what do you do about it? And your decisions impact your health scores. of, how healthy is the team, how good is your ability to deploy, how happy are your users, how happy are your executives, how happy is the team. All these health scores get affected by your decisions, and you roll dice to see what actually gets deployed, because it is within a limited scope, kind of random about how much is actually going to happen because of real world vagaries. But the best part that I've found from doing this simulation is teams get a chance to talk about these sorts of issues, the things that we're talking about here. They get to talk about real issues that they really aren't allowed to talk about at work because the stakes are too high. In the middle of the project that they're on, they can't say, well, Fred over here has totally screwed the pooch and this is why this isn't working, and whatever it might be. But here, it's just a game. It's a simulation. It's like, well, okay, if this were to happen in real life, this is what we really should do. We can't do this at our actual work, but here's what we should do. And you get really good discussions out of it, because people are in a psychologically safe environment where they can exchange ideas and have the sort of information flow outside the scope of their normal job. And then, they go back, after going through our simulation and our debriefing and everything, and they go back with these lessons like, well, okay, well, when we did this in the simulator, we were able to, make this sort of decision. What would it take to do that here? Who do we have to convince? What do we have to do? So I found that to be really helpful, for folks to be introspective and think about what they can do to make their teams better and how to handle the sorts of issues that commonly come up that we know good answers to, but that aren't commonly practiced, that folks don't really do out in the real world. And they can, and now some of them do, having gone through this sort of an experience.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, that 20 story point story that you say is going to take a month or whatever, you're not going to go and hit your keyboard all at one time over the month and just it's done. You're
Right.
going to break it down. Okay, what do I need to do first? And then you say, okay, well, then what? And then what? And then what? Like, you take your own time after you've been assigned the story to break it down yourself. And then you discover, like, okay, so I need to create all this back end logic. I need to create these items, the front end logic, the tie ins between, or whatever your situation is. And at the end of that month or whatever time frame, you look back and you said, oh, yeah, this should have been broken out. Like, it could have very easily been broken out because you actually spent the time to go through that story to see what it required, what needed to happen on there. So
Right.
if you
Now,
are doing a backlog grooming,
here's the real problem, though. Yes,
what's that?
but everything you just described, you're now, as a developer, sitting there learning all these things by yourself. You have this knowledge now that the rest of the team does not have. And that needs to get shared out somehow. Maybe that comes up in a code review. Maybe it comes up in a meeting. Maybe it doesn't. And you've got every developer doing this. So you've got all this siloed learning happening, which maybe that's okay. Probably it's not. And this is where doing something like pair programming, or even better, mob programming, ensemble programming, really helps, because now you're learning as a team. You're learning as a group. You're spreading this around, trying to figure out, because as you just said, right, when you're in the middle of doing this, you realize things. Questions come up. It's like, well, oh geez, hell, if we do this, that means we're going to have a problem over here, or we can't do this because this is contradictory to, something else that, we were told to do. So these things come up, and if you've got an overly siloed team, well, first of all, that's not a team. That's just a bunch of people working on tickets, right? For it to be a team, they actually have to do things together. And as an aside, I mean, I think of, people say, well, what do you think is one of the most interesting things in software, to come up recently, and it's not ML. It's ensemble programming or mob programming. I think that's a really interesting idea. I have heard from people that has worked remarkably well in their organizations. And given that we are almost all really serious introverts, that's why we got into programming in the first place. This kind of runs counter to where we're coming from and what we're thinking, but it also makes a whole lot of sense because, as I said, what are the two most important things that programmers do? Communicate and learn. These are better handled as group activities, right? Especially if you're off doing something that's, never been done before. I mean, if you're just, let's face it, if you're just doing something like, adding a field to the database or something sort of menial, that's not a big deal. You don't need a mob to do that. You probably don't even need a pair to do that. You've done it a bazillion times. You're just doing it again. That's just one of those things. But if you're exploring a new requirement, a new user need, and no one really knows how this is going to work, or more importantly, how this is going to affect everything else, or what the implications of it are, that's when you probably want to get more people involved, and kind of work on it together. And again, that's a skill. I know a lot of folks who've been very successful with that, who've adopted that. This is not something we promote in academia, right? Group projects never work out well in college. I have a longer story about that, but the first group project I did in college, this one guy wasn't contributing. We ended up chasing him through his frat house, and the last I saw of him was his feet disappearing up into the attic trap door. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, my
not
experience
what we
with
talk
group
about with
projects in
mob
college.
programming. Yeah.
Yeah. But my experience was the same. It was like, okay, two of us got together and did the whole thing, right? And the other two or three either showed up and watched or didn't show up at all.
Sorry for not showing up, Chuck.
I'm
I
still
was
bitter.
that guy.
I'm still bitter, Dave.
But I think that's my issue with mob programming is because I am such an introvert. Where I know this past couple of years has been really horrible for a lot of people, especially the extroverts that just thrive and refill on just people, talking with people. I have empathy for them, but for me, being such an introvert, I really thrived during the pandemic, just being at home, not having to go out, not being able to go out really. So the whole idea of mob programming kind of scares me that I don't want to be, you know, working with a bunch of people, even though they're my teammates who I talk to every day. I don't want to be on a 3 hour long remote call doing, pair mob programming. I want to just kind of be in my own little corner doing my own thing.
And that's very common. And I totally empathize with that because, despite the fact that I, used to go out and do conferences and keynotes and talks and everything, I'm a huge introvert. I mean, I've never
Mhm.
enjoyed that aspect of my career. I would much rather, as you say, sit in my corner and do my thing. And the thing is, it depends on the activity. It depends on what you're doing.
Yeah.
So, I've seen
Mhm.
places where like, oh, hey, this is great. Everyone needs to be, working together. So we're having a total open office plan. Back when people worked in offices, back in the before times when people worked in offices, right? That this
I hate
open
open
floor
office
plan,
plans.
which, oh, right. I mean, hell, that's basically the 10th level of hell right there. It's just
Mhm.
awful because it's not appropriate. Now, a big breakout room where you can deliberately go and say, okay, guys, we need to brainstorm this thing and work together on this issue. Great. That's fine. Because there are times when you need to do that. And I consider, mob programming to me is basically brainstorming, except you're writing down code while you're doing it. It's basically a brainstorming session, is how I sort of view it. And there are absolutely times where you need to do that. There's times when you need to be able to go into your office and close the door and have a nice quiet think. And, there's places in the middle. There's a new person on the team. You want to, bring she or he along and train them up. Pair programming is great for that. Here's how here's a quick tour of the code base. Here's how we do this here. This is a place we're having a problem, whatever it might be. The basic thing is, one size doesn't fit all. And context absolutely matters. And this is where almost all of these sort of attempts at methodologies or process all fail down, because they want to end up with the world looking like a Play-Doh machine, where you chuck developers in one side, squish the handle, and code pops out the other end. And it absolutely does not work that way, right? It has never worked that way. We would love for it. As a business owner, hell yes, that's dynamite. I wish it worked that way. It does not. And, it slays me that you talk about the Agile Manifesto, circling back to that for a minute. The first point, the first of the guidelines of the manifesto says individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And people ask, well, what are the second through fourth points? It's like, I've forgotten, because we haven't gotten to them yet, because we keep screwing up the first one. We haven't got this one right yet. You get a team together, and the first thing they say is, what tools are we going to use and what process are we going to use? It's like, wrong question, and here talking about mobbing versus, thinking alone and whatnot. It's all about individuals and interactions. And in this case, sometimes you need the larger interaction with the team. Sometimes you don't. It depends. And, one size just doesn't fit all. The other thing about the manifesto that kind of slays me is the very first line says, we are, I forget what it's, discovering or uncovering. We're uncovering new ways of developing software.
Better ways.
By doing it and helping other people do it. And that also got wildly misunderstood, because, what came out, then everyone's like, oh, good, we're going to do Scrum and use Jira. It's like, okay, there's nowhere there does it say that. It says we're uncovering new ways of doing stuff. And largely, we haven't been. We got stuck with people doing half of Scrum badly and saying, I've been on record now for many years saying that, Agile now means to people, we do half of Scrum badly and we use Jira. And that's their definition of Agile and their definition of software development. And they're not wrong. I mean, that's what they're doing. But we're supposed to be uncovering new ways of doing things. And some folks are. I mean, myself and my friends, we're coming up with things. The group behind the Beyond Budgeting movement, I think, is very important, because they had the insight that a lot of what screws up development projects comes from the accounting department, and comes from the idea of batch-based accounting, batch-based funding. You get your annual budget. It's like, what happened to iterative and incremental, folks? All that goes out the window when you have a batch-based organization that you have to interface with. So of course it doesn't work. So, there's some bright spots. People are figuring out new ways of doing things and better ways of organizing ourselves. But it's, it really seems to me is kind of a little too late. We have a long ways to go still.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's funny because the last couple of places that I've been putting my time in at, they have these heavyweight processes that you put into place. They're quote unquote agile processes, right? I mean, Scrum Master means the guy who makes me go to all the meetings, realistically, right? And, it's okay. Well, we're going to go through and, I mean, even the stand-up meetings I go to anymore, it's okay. Well, we're going to go down the list and we're going to solve everybody's problems, and so it's not about individuals or interaction. It's all about the process and tools. And it seems like a lot of the agile stuff has gone that direction. And the reality is like you said, we're all different, right? Some of the things that are going to light me up are going to be different from the things that light you up, and vice versa. We probably have some things in common, but we'll figure that out as we interact and work together and kind of focus on those things. One other thing I wanted to point out, though, is that I think a lot of times we even lump people into the camps of introvert versus extrovert. And I'll tell you, I don't get energized by being around a ton of people. I really enjoy talking to people. I enjoy spending time with people. But if you followed me around a conference, you'd see about 4 o'clock, I will disappear to my hotel room for a couple hours just so that I can recharge. Right.
I'm impressed
But
you
the
can
flip
make
side
it all the way
is
to
that
4
right. It depends on the day. But the flip side is that, like, I have a brother who's an extreme introvert, and he has some other things going on in his life. But during the pandemic, he didn't thrive, right? Because he didn't really have at least that baseline of, like,
Mm.
I'm pretty comfortable around my family. I have a tradition of faith that I belong to. I have these other things that kind of stack in there that give me scaffold around my life so that I can stay centered, even if I don't really want to talk to others being people outside of my inner circle. And so that's the other thing that I think is really important here is we try to understand people by categorizing them without realizing that sometimes the category is counterproductive to what we actually want from them. And so, understanding that somebody's an introvert, but also understanding that they have a healthy home and other life that supports where they're at, then they can afford to not have to go out. And anyway, I found that really interesting. So you really are down to understanding the people that you're doing things with, doing life with, doing work with, doing business with, and those interactions. And yeah, I have to say that's both the most fulfilling part and the thing that I think is probably the most underrated. One last thing that I'll add, and I've said this on the podcast several times, but this same brother and one of my cousins, they were both going through computer science programs at the same time, different universities. And they asked me within about a week of each other, they're like, okay, so what is the most important thing I can learn, right? What is the most critical skill that I can build, right, while I'm at school? And I looked at them and I said, you have to learn to work with people, right? And they couldn't believe it. They were like, it's not this algorithm, it's not this magic tech ball, whatever, right? It's just
Like, no, show me
you
how
have
to
to be
sort
able
a
to work with
binary
people,
tree.
Yeah,
right?
it's never
Sort it and
about the
then
tech.
reverse sort it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
never about the tech. It's Jerry Weinberg used to say,
Right.
every problem is a people problem. At the end of the day, it's never a tech problem. Twitter right now is not a tech
Yeah.
problem. And any of these sorts of things. But talking about that idea of understanding people in their context and how you can't really categorize people on simplistic buckets like that. There's a interesting theory I think it was in the psych literature that says that your personality is not a set of buckets like that, but in fact, your personality is an emergent phenomenon from your network relations with everyone else. So, you are a brother, a father, a son, a employee, a church
Mm-hmm.
member, a sport team member, a bar attendee, a conference speaker. It's all these different relationships with other people, and it's that network that actually forms your personality. So you are a network, not a monolith, which I find kind of an
Mm-hmm.
interesting way to look at it. And because again, this makes it you really can't put people into simple buckets that he's an introvert, he's a programmer, she's a manager, she's a tech writer, she belongs to this ethnic group or this country or this whatever it might be. None of us are that simple. I know quite a few people who aren't even from a single country. They have dual citizenship or more. They have multiple passports. You say you
Mm-hmm.
work for a particular company. Well, okay, this year, give it a year or two. That's dynamic. That's going to change. And it kind of slays me because a lot of programmers will introduce themselves as I'm a Java programmer. God help you. Or I program in Elixir, or I'm a Rust developer, or they identify
Mm-hmm.
themselves so much with the tech, and it's like that. Who cares? I mean, that's yes, right now Rust is exciting and interesting and different, and that's very cool, and it's got a steep learning curve. So hey, kudos to you for mastering that, because that's a thing. But that's not who you are. That's one of your network relationships.
So we've kind of talked our way around a lot of stuff, and I think it's all important. But if you had to boil it down to just one thing that somebody could focus on, right? It's just like, hey, master this, right? Or deeply understand this. What would that thing be at this point?
Fast feedback. Fast feedback is, I think, the most critical, most underlying thing, because it takes a lot of different forms, right? Why do we do, test driven development? Because it has nothing to do with testing, it has nothing to do with correctness or validation. It's to get
Mm-hmm.
feedback on the code. Why do we do pair programming? Well, it helps to mentor, it helps share information, you get shared learning, blah, 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 blah. Great. It's about feedback. It's about getting result. Why do we do pipe? Why do we do a CI/CD in the cloud and run the tests automatically? So we can get feedback as fast as we can. Why do we show it to a user or user representative right after we've written it? So we can get feedback as fast as we can. There was a metaphor back in the early days that said software development is like you're exploring a giant cave in the dark, like colossal cave, right? Pitch dark, and you've got a tiny, tiny little flashlight. You know, speed is not a quality you prize here. You don't want to run as fast as you can in the dark. This is a bad idea. You want to take small steps, and you don't want to outrun your headlights, as the saying goes, right? You got to stay into the beam of the flashlight. You can only go as far as you can
Mm-hmm.
see, or in other words, you can only go as fast as your feedback allows you to go. It's when you outrun your feedback, you get screwed. So you can only go as fast as the rate of feedback allows, which is why we want all the things that we want. We want to get that feedback as fast as we can, so we can correct the direction we're going in, so we don't fall off the cliff in the dark, or run into the stalactite, or whatever you like in your metaphor. Um, and that's the most critical thing, because all the stuff that we do wrong, the story size that's too big, right? Get lack of feedback, not knowing the user, not discussing things with the user. They don't see the product till it's done. Too late to get meaningful feedback. They hate it. You get bad
Mm-hmm.
reviews. You're in a world of trouble. Um, all these sorts of things really end up almost all boiling down to a question of timely feedback.
Makes sense. And that's one of the, circling back to the Agile Manifesto too, it's responding to change over following a plan, right? It's
Yeah.
having that measure, that feedback is understanding the change you're facing as you come into it.
And as humans, we hate change. We wish it didn't happen. We don't. Kent Beck's first book, the subtitle was "Embrace Change." It wasn't "Grit your teeth and work your way through it," which is kind of what we do at best. Usually, we just ignore it and hope it'll go away, and that doesn't work so well.
Yeah, that always works. Yeah, true.
But yeah, embrace change. It's because it. The other sobering thought that I guess I'll leave you on is, right now in late 2022, we are experiencing the slowest rate of technological and social change we will likely ever see. In other words, the rate of change is monotonically increasing. So whatever rate of change we're seeing now, it's only going to get faster,
Yeah,
which puts
true.
a pretty big onus on us to up our game and be able to manage and deal with that and embrace that in a better fashion than we have been.
Makes sense. Well, if that's where you're going to leave us, let's go ahead and move on to the next segment of the show. Now, I've been talking to some of the hosts on some of the shows, and I'm going to add a segment to the show right here. So we've done picks, And a lot of times folks kind of ramble on about what they're working on. And so I just figure we'll give everybody a shot at telling people what they're working on, and then we'll do the picks. So, Dave can tell us what's new with Drifting Ruby or any of the other projects he's got working on. I'll tell you about what's going on with Top End Devs. And Andy, it looks like you're still doing Grows Method and, Pragmatic Bookshelf and all that stuff. So, Dave, why don't you go first? What are you working on that you want people to know about?
Oh, geez. Right now, I'm just working on getting healthy with the kids. I have 4 kids, and we've been through this cycle of flu and strep throat, and just we're back to another sickness now. So just getting healthy, taking time. Don't burn the candle at both ends, so to speak. Take time to get rest. And that's what I've been working on. I still do my Drift and Ruby episodes, the screencast every week. And I've actually I looked back recently, and I have gone through and done one episode every single week without fail for the past 5 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
each episode takes about 20 hours to prepare, record, edit, and publish. So it's definitely a commitment. And there's times when I go on vacation and I don't have my computer with me. A lot of times I just won't have internet or my computer. So I will double up one week, put in the extra effort to do the extra recording and then have it release on the release date. So I never miss a week. So, but it does take a toll, and it is a commitment that, I think that I have now shown that it's been every single week for the past 5 years. But I enjoy doing it. And as I've done it, much to what Andy has been saying this whole time, it's when I first started out, it took maybe 30 to 40 hours for each episode. But as I've gotten better audio equipment that would remove my breath sounds and stuff, making the editing a lot easier, as I've become more familiar with my tools, I changed my processes. It wasn't a situation where, no, this is how I'm going to prepare an episode and record an episode because this is the way I've always done it. If I was in that kind of mindset, then I would still be doing it the same way, taking 40 hours a week to do a single episode. And I've streamlined the process, I think, almost as much as I can now, where I'm able to crank them out, spend less time on each episode while maintaining the same quality, if not better, because I have more experience in doing it. So get healthy and, embrace change, as Kim Beck said, as Andy pointed out.
Nice. I'm going to throw in my stuff real quick that I've been working on. So yesterday evening was our first book club. You can go sign up for that at topenddevs.com/book club. And we're reading Clean Architecture by Robert C. Martin. We had Uncle Bob on the call. It was our first call, so we only had a few of us there, but it was a lot of fun. It was great to kind of go through, these books and talk about what's there and what's changed and what's new, and, and some of the principles that apply to what we're doing. And anyway, really enjoyed it. It was terrific. And, Bob had a bunch of great insights, but the other folks who joined also had some terrific insights, from their different experience than, where Bob was when he wrote the book and where he is now. So I'm really digging that. We're also doing twice a week member calls for the Top End Devs membership. And the next one is going to be on Friday, so tomorrow. And we're doing resume reviews. And I'm going to walk through how to set your resume up to put you forward on the right foot, because I'm seeing a bunch of people either quitting or getting laid off from different places for different reasons. And, I want to be able to help folks. So that's going to be part of the deal too. And incidentally, if you want to get a copy of my resume, I took like my cell number off of it. But, if you want to get a copy of my resume so that you can kind of see how I've set things up and arrange things for, when I apply to, contract positions or full-time positions, you can get that at topenddevs.com/resume. You just put your email address in, you get it for free. And that's kind of the stuff that I'm really focused on getting working, and then just cleaning up the Top End Devs website with all the podcasts and stuff. So yeah. Andy, what do you have going on?
You guys have been busy doing real work. I have been tied up moving, which is its own particular level of hell.
Oh man.
And we've done this sort of a couple times in the last number of years, but this was one of those hard moves where it was a downsizing move. You know, the kids were up and grown, and now we're trying to stuff everything into a much smaller venue, and that's been its own challenge, especially as we were doing some construction while we were moving, and the timing didn't quite work out between, you know, supply chain issues and labor issues and whatnot. We had everything moving in before there was places ready for it. So that has been inordinately time consuming. But we're almost out of the woods on that adventure. And the running joke now with my wife and I is we are never moving again. They're going to have to bury us here. That's it. We're done. It's too hard. So that's been some fun. But yeah, as you said, I've been continuing doing stuff with the Grows Method, which is at growsmethod.com. We're actually about to have a public workshop, which we don't do a lot of, but we're about to have one come out in the first quarter. So if that's something that any of your listeners are interested in, traipse over to growsmethod.com and sign up. We'll tell you when that's coming. I am at Pragmatic Andy on both Mastodon and the Bird site. So I'm pretty easy to find there. My web home is at toolshed.com. So if you're interested in any of the stuff that I'm involved in, whether it's Grows or the Pragmatic Bookshelf or my fiction books or my music hobby, you can find all of that there. And and I've been working on all of those. I've got some short stories on the way. I've got some music compositions I've been working on. I've got some new workshops coming up. Maybe another book or two. We'll see what happens.
Well, looking forward to it. All right. Well, now we're going to go ahead and do picks. And that's just us shouting out about stuff we like. So, Dave, go ahead.
All right. So, what's new? Well, I think the newest thing, I have a Blackmagic camera because I like doing a bit of video work and stuff. And I've always just kind of done it just as you would normally with a handheld camcorder. But recently, I have gotten into cages. So Tilta makes a really nice cage for the Blackmagic camera that allows you to bolt on and do all kinds of cool things. And I could actually grab it. So you can turn your little point and shoot camera rig or whatever into this monstrosity of a like production quality level thing with all these add-ons, battery screens, and all this other stuff. So it's really cool.
Awesome. I'm going to throw out some picks. I always do a board game pick. I'm going to pick the game Camel Up. It's a pretty simple game. You roll the dice, you move the camels, you can buy or bet on a camel. Anyway, fun stuff. So I'm going to pick Camel Up. Board Game Geek rates it a 1.47. So it's a simple game, easy to pick up. Kids can play it, and it's a fun game. It's a fast one too. It's like half hour. So I'll shout out about that. Then my wife and I last night, I didn't realize that they had done it, but we used to watch Criminal Minds. We really enjoyed that show, and they have on CBS Interactive / Paramount Plus / whatever they call it now. They have a new series that's only on the Paramount Plus. And anyway, we watched the first episode and really enjoyed it. I was wondering if it was going to be like a reboot of the show with the same characters or not. And it is basically at this point a reboot of the show with the same characters, which is nice, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, it's, 2 or 3 years later, and their lives have moved along some, and different things have affected them differently. And yeah, anyway, we're digging that, so I'm going to pick that too. And then just remind people you can watch the World Cup. I'm watching it. I'm loving it. You can watch the replays for free on Tubi. That's TUBI. And so yeah, I didn't have to go get another subscription. I just watch it on there. So that's what I've been doing. I've managed to stay mostly spoiler free too, if I've waited a day or two to see a match. So anyway, those are my picks. Andy, what are your picks?
So I'm sitting here thinking, golly, what have I been playing with lately? So two things come to mind: one professional, one hobby. On the profession side, I've always struggled to find an appropriate kind of to-do list sort of technology, and I used Trello for the longest time because I liked having the cards and the boards, but there wasn't really an easy way to the way that I work, especially with all my different interests. I've got different companies and different projects that I'm all working on, and I want like the one or two to do items on each list to get pulled up into a master sort of to do list for the day. And it turns out that's kind of a hard thing to do in most systems. You either have to go in and like deliberately set statuses and do magic filters and all kinds of this kabuki dance, and it's very cumbersome. So I abandoned. And the other thing that happens is, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but anytime any to-do list technology, you get to a point where you have to declare list bankruptcy because the to-do list has gotten so big and there's so much stuff jammed in it, you will never complete these items before the heat death of the universe. So it becomes like a doom box. You've thrown all this stuff in and you're never going to get to it. So that happened to me with Trello. I had so much stuff stuffed in it. It's like, fine, I'm just calling it to do bankruptcy. And I moved on and tried ClickUp. And ClickUp is a really nice tool in concept. It's very flexible. Anything that you put in, you can view as a list or as a table, sort of Kanban style, or as a table or a list, thing of cards, or just a straight up list. So you've got these different views you can do with everything. It's got a lot of nice stuff. The problem is it is slow as a pig on stilts. It's just very painful to use. And they do something that a lot of modern apps do that absolutely gives me a migraine. When you're trying to scroll or move your cursor over the field for any reason, everything you go over suddenly blows up extra big to show you detail. It's like this default hover zoom kind of thing, which when you've got a number of cards or things you're working with, it's like giving me like photosensitive epilepsy. It's just bang, right in your face. And I cannot stand that. And it's not unique to them. I mean, this is a anti-pattern in a lot of UX these days. So I've moved and I used ClickUp for about a year or two, and it suffered the same problem Trello had for some reason. All the lists got really big. So I declared bankruptcy on that one and moved on to Linear. And Linear is very nice. It's cross-platform, runs on Linux and web browser and Mac and Windows. And the nice thing about that is it was clearly designed by developers because everything's got a keyboard shortcut. Chains of and it's not like Emacs Pinky where you have to control alt Apple F16 nonsense. It's you want to change the status to urgent, you hit SU return, boom. So it's that sort of thing. Very simple keystrokes, very easy to go in and do its business. I had a question, their tech support got like right back to me with a thing. So they're until I fill it up, they're my current favorite in that world. And then on the hobby side, they added this spec to the MIDI specification for piano keyboards, electronic keyboards, synthesizer keyboards with polyphonic expression. And there's been this nice trend all of a sudden with a couple of, not many, but like say 4 or 5 sort of boutique manufacturers who are moving the state of the art beyond pressing a key down to get a note. And, we've had for many years now, well, if you press the key faster and harder, you get a different value than if you press it lightly, dynamite. But now we're getting much more of after you've hit the note, you can press the key harder and get data out of it. You can wiggle your finger side to side. You can wiggle your finger from the back of the keys to the front. You can do these different sort of gestural controls on what's more or less a standard looking key bed to get a wide range of expressive capabilities that did not exist, sort of before. And there was, a few vintage synths back in the day that had this, but it was expensive and it never really caught on. But, material science and, the increasing race with Moore's law to get more on smaller chips now gives us a lot more ability to do some really cool things in that space. So I'm watching a couple of them, if you are on like Kickstarters, if you are out as real projects. And I think there's some real excitement there that we can do a lot more with synthesizers or even orchestral simulation than was possible before. And that's the kind of tech that I really excites me. That lights me up.
I'm looking at Linear because you've basically explained my whole existence with any list option.
Brian Bates recently recommended Linear too, I think, on Twitter.
Yeah, it's it looks like it's a project management tool, but is it, if that's the right one, linear.app?
Yeah, that's it.
But yeah.
So it has a lot of features
right,
that I'm not using, but you can tie into pull requests, which you shouldn't be using on an internal development project. That's a side note, but yeah, it does a lot of stuff. So if you're doing that kind of thing, it's got you covered.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming, Andy. This was a fun chat, and a lot of stuff I agree with. A handful of things I want to go look deeper in, and yeah.
Awesome. And it just, I've said this in a lot of keynote addresses. It's like my fond wish is to come in and talk for an hour about the very most important things that we need in programming and have everyone in the audience nod and say, yes, Andy, that's what we're doing. That's what I want to be, to have the most boring keynote because everything I'm saying, people are already doing. Wouldn't that be that's my goal. That's my professional goal. And we're not there yet.
All right. Well, till next time, folks, max out.